So, ever heard about the woman who sued a city over, get this, a falling coconut?
Oh,
Right.
wow.
Sounds like a joke, like out of one of those ridiculous lawsuits calendars.
Yeah.
But that, my friend, is the sometimes wacky, sometimes wild world of torts. Welcome to the deep dive.
I'm excited to be here.
Glad to have you. We're diving deep, no pun intended, into this fascinating, honestly fascinating area of law that, and trust me on this, is way more relatable than you might think.
Definitely.
I mean, we're talking fender benders, we're talking noisy neighbors. Even that time, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but that time your friend borrowed your lawnmower and then just kind of forgot to give it back.
Oh, yeah. I've been there.
Yeah. See, everyday situations, relatable situations, but all with potentially serious legal consequences.
You're right. Torts are everywhere when you start thinking about it.
They really are.
And essentially, it boils down to this idea of civil wrongs, those oops, I did something bad moments, or even sometimes intentionally harmful actions that can lead someone to sue you. We call that legal liability.
Okay, so let's unpack this, shall we? I feel like a good place to start is with this concept of negligence, right? It's considered the most common type of tort. And if we're being honest here, I feel like at some point in our lives, we've all been on one side of this, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're all human. We all make mistakes.
Exactly.
And that's often what negligence is all about. You know, think of it this way. Everyone has a duty to act reasonably toward others.
Okay.
So a driver has a duty to obey traffic laws. A doctor has a duty to care for their patients appropriately.
Right. Makes sense.
Negligence is when you breach or break that duty in some way, and that breach causes harm to another person.
So let's say, using your example, running a red light
Okay.
would be a breach of that duty
Right.
because you're not obeying traffic laws.
Sure.
But how does the law actually connect the dots between that action, running a red light, and then, let's say, someone getting injured?
Right.
How is that connected legally?
Yeah, that's where causation comes in. So you have to be able to prove that the breach of duty directly led to the harm suffered. So in your red light example, the person who was injured would have to show that the accident wouldn't have happened if the other driver hadn't run the red light.
So there needs to be like a direct cause and effect.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
And of course, there have to be actual damages,
Right.
meaning like real harm is done.
Real harm, yeah.
Whether it's physical injury, medical bills, property damage.
Yeah, things like that.
It can't just be like, well, I was inconvenienced.
Right. It has to be something tangible.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, sometimes it's not an accident. Sometimes actions are intentionally harmful, and that's where things get really interesting. Welcome to the world of intentional torts.
Ooh, intentional torts. So we're not talking about clumsy mishaps here. We're talking about intentionally.
Right. Things are done on purpose.
What are some like specific examples of what would fall under that umbrella?
Well, let's start with battery, which most people, when they hear that, think of like fist fights, right?
Like a physical altercation.
Right. But it's actually broader than that. Battery is really about any intentional and unwanted touching that ends up harming someone.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a bit of a legal curveball. Even if the harm is way worse than intended, let's say someone has a super fragile skull, we call that the eggshell skull rule, you're still on the hook for the full extent of that harm.
Oh, wow. So are you trying to tell me that like even a doctor performing surgery without the patient's consent, that could be considered battery?
Absolutely. It all comes down to consent.
Uh-huh.
Any medical procedure done without informed consent, meaning the person knows the risks and benefits and agrees to it, could fall into the category of battery.
Okay, well, that's a little unnerving. I'll be sure to ask my doctor next time if I need to sign something. Okay, so what about assault? Because I feel like assault and battery are often like lumped together, but there's a difference, right?
Yeah, they're definitely distinct. Think of assault as that like heart-stopping moment before something happens. It's the threat of immediate harm that creates the legal issue. Like, remember that scene in insert movie title where, like, that celebrity bodyguard, he doesn't even touch anyone, but he just steps forward and he's got that, like, menacing look on his face.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Pure assault.
Right. And you're just like waiting for something to happen. I
Exactly.
remember thinking like, oh, this is about to get real. Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about physical harm. We've talked about the threat of physical harm. But what about situations where, like, someone's freedom is restricted?
You're talking about false imprisonment.
Oh, okay.
And no, it doesn't necessarily involve an actual prison.
Right.
It's about being confined against your will.
Oh.
I'm sure you've seen those news stories about, like, People being falsely detained in stores because a store detective or something thinks they shoplifted.
Oh, yeah.
Classic example of false
See, I
imprisonment.
could see how easily that could happen. Okay, so protecting ourselves physically is one thing, but what about our stuff? That's where property torts come in, right?
You got it. Let's say your neighbor borrows your lawnmower, but then forgets to return it, like for a year.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that's not cool. But legally speaking, that could be what we call trespass to chattels, meaning they interfered with your right to your own personal property.
So chattels is just a fancy legal term for stuff.
Basically, yeah. Your car, your phone, even that prize-winning, I don't know, petunia you're so proud of,
Right.
those are all chattels.
My precious petunias.
Exactly. And when someone messes with your chattels without your permission, that's when you might have a legal issue.
Okay, so boundaries are important.
Yes.
Whether it's, physical boundaries with land or these ownership boundaries with personal property.
Hmm.
Speaking of boundaries, though, what about those situations where, like, a neighbor's actions are just plain annoying, like legally annoying?
Ah, you're talking about the classic nuisance tort.
Oh, the good old nuisance.
Exactly. And this one is more than just, a minor inconvenience. It has to be something that truly interferes with your use and enjoyment of your property. Imagine a neighbor who decides to start, like, a composting business in their backyard, but the smell is so bad that it makes your eyes water every time you step outside.
Ugh, yeah. I've actually been there. One time, my neighbor, I don't know what he was thinking, decided it would be a great idea to start practicing his bagpipes
Oh, no.
in his backyard at dawn every day.
Every day.
Every single day. It was like a siren song gone very, very wrong.
I bet. That sounds pretty disruptive. That sounds like it could be a nuisance.
Definitely a legal gray area,
Yeah?
but one we can explore another time, maybe when we deep dive into the wonderful world of noise ordinances.
Hmm.
Okay, so far we've covered situations where, someone acted carelessly. We've talked about intentionally causing harm. What about those scenarios where someone's held responsible, legally responsible, even if they didn't mean to do anything wrong?
That's where strict liability comes in, and it's a whole different ballgame.
Okay, how so?
It's kind of like the law is saying, hey, even if you weren't being careless, even if you didn't mean to cause harm, this activity you're doing is so inherently risky that if something goes wrong, you're responsible.
So like transporting explosives would be an example of that.
Definitely. Or like keeping wild animals as pets.
Yeah, okay. I can see why those would be considered inherently risky.
Right. Those are prime examples of what we call abnormally dangerous activities. And that's where strict liability often applies.
Okay.
It's all about managing the risk associated with things that could have really severe consequences if something goes wrong.
So it's not about fault. It's more about, like, the level of risk involved.
Exactly. And strict liability can also apply to more, shall we say, everyday things. I'm thinking about defective products and things like that.
Oh, yeah. Like if my toaster oven explodes,
Right.
burns down my kitchen, am I responsible? Or is the company that made this faulty toaster oven responsible?
Yeah. So that's a great example of what we call product liability, and it often falls under strict liability.
Oh.
So if that toaster does explode and burn down your kitchen, the manufacturer could be held liable even if they weren't directly negligent in, like, making that specific toaster.
Interesting.
It's about this idea of a broader responsibility of companies to make sure their products are safe when they're selling them to the public.
Wow. So in the world of torts, sometimes even existing can be risky.
Well, in a way, yes, but it really highlights how the law tries to balance individual freedoms with the responsibility to protect others from harm.
I like that. It's about finding that balance. Well, this has been quite the crash course, wouldn't you say? We went from falling coconuts to exploding toasters and everything in between, all in the name of understanding torts.
It's a lot to digest, for sure, but honestly, understanding these basic principles, I think, can be really empowering
Totally.
because it helps you navigate everyday situations, understand your own rights and responsibilities a little better.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Right.
So next time you find yourself, hearing about a bizarre lawsuit or just wondering about the legal implications of, like, I don't know, a runaway drone, remember, torts are everywhere.
They are everywhere.
You might even start spotting them in your own life. And hopefully now you'll be a little bit better equipped to navigate those, shall we say, legally sticky situations.
Definitely. And if not, call a lawyer.
There you go. Sound advice from the expert. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time,
Thanks for having me.
see you later.